Have you ever heard of the Bridgewater Triangle? No? Well, let me tell you, there's a reason people avoid it, even though it's just a patch of woods in Massachusetts. 20 years ago, I thought it was all just spooky campfire stories. I was wrong. I remember sitting in our RV late that night, heart racing, Brian whispering, "Do you hear that?" There was something outside, something that wasn't human. The sound of footsteps circled us, and then laughter. Soft, faint, but chilling. Then it said my name. It said my name. By the time we realized what we'd done, what we'd disturbed, it was too late. The thing about the Bridgewater Triangle is, once you've been marked, it never really lets you go. This is my story, and I promise, it's not for the faint of heart. But first, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Hit the notification bell so you never miss a story like this one. And tell me in the comments, have you ever been somewhere that just felt wrong? Have you ever been somewhere that just didn't feel right? A place so heavy with silence, it made your skin crawl? For me, that place is the Bridgewater Triangle. 20 years ago, my friends and I set out on a summer road trip in an old RV, thinking we'd find adventure and a few good stories to tell. We got more than we bargained for. I'll never forget that night. We were parked deep in Freetown State Forest, surrounded by nothing but trees and darkness. At first, it felt like a typical camping trip. Marshmallows roasting over a campfire, laughter echoing into the night. But then things started to happen. Small things at first. A branch snapping just beyond the firelight. Shadows moving where there shouldn't have been any. And then the laughter started, except it wasn't ours. We thought it was a prank, maybe some other campers messing with us. But the laughter was wrong. It didn't sound human. It was high-pitched, faint, almost playful. But underneath it was something else, a deeper, guttural tone, like it came from a place no living thing should ever be able to reach. That was the first time we realized we weren't alone. 20 years later, I still think about that night. The laughter, the claw marks we found on the RV in the morning, and the thing we saw just before we left. I don't tell this story to scare you. I tell it because it's real. And if you've ever thought about exploring the Bridgewater Triangle, you should know what you're getting into. So let me take you back to the summer of 2003, when my friends and I thought we were invincible and the woods were just woods. Let me tell you about the worst night of my life. It started as a joke. My best friend, Brian, had been obsessed with urban legends since we were kids. Bigfoot, the Loch Ness Monster, aliens. If it was weird and unexplained, Brian wanted to know about it. So when Samantha, our resident daredevil, suggested we spend a weekend exploring the Bridgewater Triangle, Brian jumped at the chance. The rest of us, not so much. "Come on," Samantha said, her grin practically daring us to say no. "It'll be fun. We'll roast marshmallows, tell ghost stories, and maybe we'll even see one of those UFOs people are always talking about. Or we'll get murdered by a bunch of Satanists." Derek quipped, leaning back in his chair. "Have you read anything about this place? Cults, animal sacrifices, people going missing. I'm good, thanks." "You're such a chicken," Samantha shot back. "Yeah, well, at least I'll be a live chicken." Lena, ever the quiet one, shrugged. "It might be interesting. Besides, it's just a forest. What's the worst that could happen?" Famous last words. By the time we piled into Brian's beat-up RV, Derek's protests had been drowned out by Samantha's enthusiasm and Brian's relentless trivia about the Bridgewater Triangle. Did you know it's one of the most haunted places in America? Did you know people have seen glowing orbs and phantom hitchhikers? Did you know the Wampanoag tribe called this land cursed? Brian, I said, cutting him off before he could launch into another factoid. Can we just get there before you scare us all to death? Fine, he said, smirking. But don't come crying to me when we get abducted by aliens. The drive to Freetown State Forest took most of the day. By the time we arrived, the sun was starting to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows over the trees. The air was thick and still, and the only sound was the crunch of gravel under the RV's tires. I don't like this, Derek muttered as we pulled into a clearing. It's too quiet. Relax, Samantha said, hopping out of the RV. It's just nature. You know, no Wi-Fi, no traffic, no screaming kids. Enjoy it. But Derek wasn't wrong. It was too quiet. No birds, no crickets, not even the rustle of leaves in the breeze. Just silence. We set up camp near a fire pit someone had left behind, complete with a circle of rocks and a pile of half-burned logs. The first hour or so was normal enough. We built a fire, roasted marshmallows, and swapped dumb stories about ghosts and monsters. Brian, of course, had to outdo us all with a story about a man who disappeared in the forest back in the 1970s, leaving behind nothing but a set of footprints that stopped abruptly, as if he'd been plucked off the ground. Cool story, Derek said, rolling his eyes. But I'm pretty sure the guy just got lost and fell into a sinkhole or something. Sure, Brian said. Or maybe the triangle got him. Derek snorted. The only thing this triangle is going to get is a bunch of gullible tourists like you. Guys, Lena said, cutting them off. Did you hear that? We all froze, straining to hear. At first, there was nothing, just the crackle of the fire and the sound of our own breathing. But then, snap, a branch breaking. Probably just an animal, Samantha said, though her voice wavered slightly. Yeah, Brian agreed. A deer or something. But deep down, I think we all knew it wasn't. That night, I couldn't sleep. The RV felt too small, too cramped, like the walls were closing in on me. I lay on the pull-out bed, staring at the ceiling and listening to the forest. That's when I heard it. A faint sound, almost like laughter. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but then it came again, louder this time. High-pitched and breathy, like a child giggling. I sat up, my heart pounding. Brian, I whispered, do you hear that? Hear what? He mumbled, half asleep. The laughing. He groaned and rolled over. It's just the wind. Go back to sleep. But it wasn't the wind. The next morning I told the group about what I'd heard. You were probably just dreaming, Samantha said, though she avoided looking at me. Yeah, Derek agreed. Or maybe it was one of those ghost kids Brian's always going on about. I forced a laugh, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. As we packed up camp, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. Footprints. Small, bare footprints circling the RV. Guys, I said, my voice shaking. Come look at this. Brian knelt down, studying the prints. They're too small to be ours, and they weren't here last night. Maybe it was a prank, Derek said, though he didn't sound convinced. Maybe, Brian said, but the look on his face said otherwise. And that was just the beginning. Have you ever felt like you weren't supposed to be somewhere? Like every shadow was watching? Every sound was a warning you ignored? That's what we felt as we sat in that RV. surrounded by the endless, silent trees of the Bridgewater Triangle. And then the laughter started. It wasn't human. It wasn't close. But it was coming closer. What would you do? Would you stay and investigate, or would you run? We thought we could handle it. We were wrong. Stick around, because this story is just getting started. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Hit that notification bell so you never miss an update. And let me know in the comments. Have you ever been somewhere that just felt wrong? Alright, let's dive in. When we arrived at Freetown State Forest, the sun was dipping low, casting everything in that golden hour glow that makes even the creepiest places seem inviting. The gravel road crunched under the tires of the old RV as we turned into a clearing surrounded by dense trees. I remember leaning against the window, trying to take it all in. The forest was beautiful, no doubt about it, but there was something off. Here we are, Brian said, pulling the RV to a stop and killing the engine. Welcome to the Bridgewater Triangle, everyone. The land of UFOs, ghosts, and other unexplainable weirdness. Samantha jumped out first, stretching her arms above her head and breathing in deeply. Smells like adventure, she said, grinning. Derek groaned, tossing his phone onto the dashboard. Smells like dirt and bad decisions. Lena stepped out quietly, her eyes scanning the treetops like she was looking for something. It's quiet, she said softly. She was right. There were no birds chirping, no rustle of leaves in the breeze, no distant hum of insects. Just silence, the kind that presses against your ears and makes you feel like the whole world is holding its breath. Relax, Samantha said, breaking the spell as she grabbed her backpack from the RV. It's nature. What did you expect? A marching band. Just saying, Lena muttered, but her unease was contagious. The first task was setting up camp. We found an old fire pit in the clearing, surrounded by a ring of rocks and some charwood that must have been left behind by the last group of campers. Brian and Samantha gathered firewood, while Derek complained about everything. His bug bites, the lack of Wi-Fi, and how he'd rather be at a beach. Derek, you volunteered to come? I reminded him, tossing him a bundle of sticks. No! I got tricked into coming, he shot back, catching the sticks. There's a difference. While we worked, Lena wandered off toward the edge of the clearing, her arms crossed over her chest. Hey! I called out. You good? She nodded but didn't turn around. Yeah, just listening. Listening to what? She hesitated. I don't know. It's like there's something out there, watching us. A shiver ran down my spine, but I shook it off. You're probably just spooked because of Brian's stories. Maybe, she said, but the look on her face didn't change. As the sun sank behind the trees, we lit the fire and sat around it, the flames casting flickering shadows on our faces. It should have felt cozy, but the oppressive silence of the forest kept us all on edge. Even Derek seemed unusually quiet. So, Brian said, breaking the tension, you guys want to hear about the Pukwudgies? The what now? I asked, raising an eyebrow. Pukwudgies, he repeated, leaning forward, the firelight dancing in his eyes. They're these little troll-like creatures from Wampanoag folklore. Mischievous, kind of like goblins, but they're also dangerous. They'll trick you into getting lost in the woods, lead you to your death. Some people even say they push people off cliffs. Cool story, bro, Derek said, rolling his eyes. But we're in a forest, not a cliff. Brian smirked. Don't worry, they can still find creative ways to kill you. Samantha laughed. You're so full of it, Brian. Next, You'll be telling us Bigfoot lives here too. Actually, nope, she interrupted, holding up a hand. I'm cutting you off. No more campfire ghost stories tonight. As the fire crackled and the stars came out, things started to feel a little more normal. We roasted marshmallows, told dumb jokes, and even got Derek to crack a smile. For a while, it felt like just another camping trip. But then, around 10 p.m., the mood shifted. It started with a sound. Snap. All of us froze, our heads snapping toward the darkness beyond the firelight. What was that? Lena whispered. Probably just a deer, Samantha said, though her voice lacked its usual confidence. Snap. This time it was louder, closer. Derek grabbed a stick from the pile of firewood and held it like a weapon. Okay, if this is some kind of prank, it's not funny. No one's pranking you, Derek, Brian said, standing up and squinting into the trees. It's probably just an animal. Relax. But I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hand hovered near his flashlight, like he was ready to bolt. Maybe we should go back to the RV, Lena suggested, her voice trembling. Samantha shook her head. Come on, guys. We're in a forest. Animals make noise. That's how it works. But what if it's not an animal? I said, surprising myself. Everyone turned to look at me, and for a moment, no one spoke. Eventually, Brian decided to investigate. He grabbed the flashlight and pointed it toward the tree line. See? Nothing but trees, he said, stepping closer. Dude, don't, Derek said, clutching his stick tighter. It's fine, Brian insisted. I just want to see what's out there. Samantha rolled her eyes. You're all acting like we're in a horror movie. It's probably a raccoon or something. But as Brian stepped further into the darkness, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. Brian, Lena called softly. Please don't go too far. He didn't answer, just kept walking. The flashlight beam bobbed up and down, the light growing fainter as he disappeared into the trees. For a long moment, all we could hear was the sound of his footsteps crunching on the forest floor. Then, suddenly, crack! The sound of a branch snapping, loud and violent, echoed through the clearing. Brian, Samantha called. No response. Brian, this isn't funny, Derek shouted, his voice rising with panic. We all stared into the darkness, waiting for him to come back. And then, just as I was about to go after him, the flashlight beam reappeared. See, Brian said, stepping back into the clearing. Nothing. Out there but trees and... He stopped mid-sentence, his face pale. What? I asked. Slowly, he held up the flashlight. The plastic casing was covered in long, deep scratches, like something with claws had tried to tear it apart. Okay, Derek said, backing toward the RV. Screw this. I'm out. We all agreed to sleep in the RV that night. As we locked the doors and tried to laugh off what had happened, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd made a mistake. The forest outside was dark and still, but I could swear I heard it again, that faint, high-pitched laughter just beyond the edge of the firelight. And I knew deep down that we weren't alone. The next morning, we woke to an unsettling sight. Brian had been the first to step outside the RV, rubbing his eyes and muttering about the awful coffee we'd brought. But his grumbling stopped the moment his foot hit the ground. He froze, staring at something just beyond the clearing. What is it? Samantha asked, stepping out behind him. Brian didn't answer. He just pointed. When I followed his gaze, my stomach twisted. The fire pit we'd gathered around the night before was surrounded by symbols drawn in the dirt. They were crude and jagged, like someone had scraped them with a stick or their fingers. Circles, triangles, and lines crisscrossed each other in a way that looked random but felt purposeful, deliberate. "Okay, what the hell?" Derek said, stepping out of the RV with Lena behind him. "I don't remember seeing that last night," Brian said, his voice tight. "Of course you didn't," Derek shot back. "Because it wasn't there. Someone or something did this while we were sleeping." Lena knelt by one of the symbols, tracing it lightly with her finger. "They're not random," she said softly. Samantha crouched next to her. "What do you mean?" Lena didn't answer right. "Away." She tilted her head, squinting at the patterns, then said, they look familiar. I've seen something like this before in a book about Native American folklore." "Great," Derek said. "So what? Is this some kind of ritual?" "Maybe," Lena murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Samantha stood and brushed her hands on her jeans. "Look, it's probably just a prank. Some other campers messing with us. Let's not freak out." "Sure," Derek said, crossing his arms. "Because random pranksters love sneaking into the woods in the middle of the night to draw creepy symbols. Makes perfect sense." Despite the eerie start to the morning, Samantha insisted we stick to our plan to explore the forest. "We came here to have an adventure," she said, tying her hair back. "And I'm not going to let some spooky drawings ruin that." Brian agreed, though he seemed more subdued than usual. Derek grumbled but didn't argue. Lena was the only one who hesitated, her eyes flicking nervously toward the tree line as we packed our bags and set off. We hadn't gone far when we stumbled upon the cabin. It was hidden in a grove of trees, half swallowed by vines and moss. The roof had caved in on one side, and the wooden planks were warped and rotting. But it wasn't the condition of the cabin that made us stop. It was the way it felt. The air around it was heavier, colder, even though the sun was shining. The silence we'd noticed before was even more pronounced here, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. "Whoa," Brian said, breaking the silence. "This wasn't on the map." "Yeah, no kidding," Derek said. "Maybe because no one's supposed to be here." "Guys, look at this," Lena called from the side of the cabin. We followed her voice and found her standing next to a small, half-buried cellar door. The wood was dark with age and cracked in places, but it was clear that someone or something had been there recently. Deep scratches marred the surface, like claw marks, and the rusted latch was broken. Samantha knelt to examine it. "This doesn't look like an animal," she said, running her fingers over the grooves. "Whatever made these, it wasn't natural." "Well, that's comforting," Derek muttered. Brian tugged on the latch, and with a loud creak, the cellar door swung open. A rush of damp, musty air hit us, carrying with it a faint metallic tang that made my stomach churn. "Are you serious?" Derek said, backing away. "You're not actually thinking of going down there?" "Of course we are," Samantha said, already shining her flashlight into the darkness. Brian grinned. "Come on, Derek. Where's your sense of adventure?" "Back in the RV," he shot back. Lena hesitated at the edge of the opening, her arms wrapped around herself. "I don't think this is a good idea," she said quietly. "Relax," Samantha said, her voice more confident than it should have been. "It's just an old cellar. What's the worst that could happen?" The stairs groaned under our weight as we descended into the dark. Brian went first, holding the flashlight, followed by Samantha, then me, Lena, and Derek bringing up the rear. The air grew colder the further we went, and the metallic smell grew stronger. When we reached the bottom, Brian swung the flashlight around, revealing a small, cramped space with dirt walls and a low ceiling. The first thing I noticed was the carvings. They were everywhere, etched into the dirt walls, scrawled on the remains of wooden beams, even scratched. Into the stone floor. They looked like the symbols we'd seen around the fire pit, but these were older, more intricate. What the hell is this place? Derek whispered. I don't know, Brian said, his voice tinged with awe. But it's incredible. Incredible isn't the word I'd use, Samantha muttered. In the center of the room was a small stone altar, covered in dried blood and surrounded by more carvings. A chill ran down my spine as I stepped closer, the flashlight beam illuminating something lying on the altar. It was a book. The cover was cracked and faded, the leather worn smooth in places. Brian reached for it, and I grabbed his arm. Don't, I said. Why not? He asked, frowning. Because this place is already creepy enough without you messing with cursed books. I said, only half joking. But Brian shook me off and picked it up. The air seemed to grow heavier as he opened it, flipping through the yellowed pages. It's in Latin, he said, squinting at the text. Great, Derek said. Now we're in a bad horror movie. Let me guess, if you read it out loud, demons come out. Brian ignored him, tracing his finger over the words. It's a ritual, he said slowly. Something about summoning a guardian. A guardian for what? Samantha asked. I don't know, Brian admitted, but it's... A loud crash interrupted him, echoing through the cellar. We all froze, our heads snapping toward the stairs. What was that? Lena whispered. Probably just the wind, Brian said, though his voice wavered. No, Derek said, backing toward the stairs. Nope, I'm done. We're leaving. For once, no one argued with him. We scrambled back up the stairs, our footsteps loud and hurried. When we reached the surface, the forest felt even quieter than before, as if it were waiting for something. Brian stuffed the book into his backpack, despite my protests. It's evidence, he said. We can't just leave it. Evidence of what? I snapped. That we're idiots? Guys, Lena said, her voice trembling. I think we should go back to the RV. We all turned to look at her, and my stomach dropped. She was staring at the trees, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. What is it? Samantha asked. Lena didn't answer. She just pointed. I followed her gaze and felt my blood run cold. Between the trees, just beyond the clearing, was a shadow. It was tall and thin, its shape shifting and flickering like smoke, and it was watching us. That night, the forest came alive. After our unsettling discovery in the cabin cellar, we agreed to head back to the RV and stay close to camp. No one said it out loud, but the fear was palpable. Even Samantha, who usually brushed everything off with a joke or a smirk, had fallen quiet. The book Brian had taken sat on the RV's dining table, its cracked leather cover looking like it didn't belong in this world. Why'd you have to bring it? Derek muttered, pacing the small space. He hadn't stopped complaining since we got back. We should have left it there. It's a historical artifact, Brian argued, his voice firm but a little defensive. It could explain what's going on out here. Or it could curse us all. Derek snapped, throwing up his hands. You saw those symbols. You saw that blood. And you still thought, hey, let's bring this creepy-ass book back to our tiny RV. Brilliant, Brian. Just brilliant. Guys, enough, Samantha said, rubbing her temples. Arguing isn't going to help. Lena sat in the corner, her knees pulled to her chest, staring out the window into the dark forest. "It's already too late," she said softly. "What's that supposed to mean?" Derek demanded, turning to her. Lena didn't answer. She just kept staring out the window. Around 10 p.m., the noises started again. It began as faint scratching, like twigs brushing against the side of the RV. At first, I thought it was the wind, but when I glanced out the window, the trees were completely still. "Do you hear that?" I asked, breaking the silence. Brian frowned, tilting his head to listen. "Yeah, what is that?" The scratching grew louder, more insistent. It moved along the RV, starting at the back and making its way toward the front. "Okay, nope," Derek said, grabbing the largest knife from the kitchenette. "Nope, nope, nope." "Calm down," Samantha said, though her voice was shaky. Suddenly, the scratching stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, pressing in on us like a physical weight. Then came the laughter. It was faint at first, so soft that I thought I might have imagined it. But it grew louder, high-pitched and breathy, like a child giggling in the distance. "What the hell is that?" Samantha whispered, her eyes wide. "Not funny, Brian," Derek said, pointing the knife at him. "It's not me," Brian snapped. The laughter grew louder, echoing all around us. It was coming from the forest, or maybe it was right outside the RV. It was impossible to tell. Lena stood up suddenly, her face pale. "It's them," she said, her voice trembling. "Who?" I asked, my heart pounding. "The shadows," she said, pointing out the window. "They're here." I followed her gaze and froze. Outside, just beyond the firelight, the shadows had returned. They flickered and shifted like smoke, darting between the trees, moving closer and closer. "Okay, we're leaving," Derek said, backing toward the driver's seat. "Wait," Brian said, grabbing his arm. "We can't just leave." "What if—" A loud bang cut him off. It sounded like something had slammed against the side of the RV. The whole vehicle shook and Lena screamed, pressing herself against the wall. "Start the engine," Samantha yelled. Derek didn't need to be told twice. He jumped into the driver's seat and turned the key. The engine sputtered, coughed, and died. "No, no, no," Derek muttered, trying again. The engine refused to start. Another bang, louder this time, rocked the RV. The laughter outside turned into a chorus, overlapping voices that didn't belong to any human. "Do something," Samantha shouted. Brian grabbed the book and started flipping through the pages, his hands shaking. "There has to be something in here," he muttered. "What are you looking for?" I demanded. "I don't know. A way to stop this." The banging grew more violent, as if whatever was outside was trying to tear its way in. The windows rattled, and the laughter turned into guttural growls. Then we heard it, a voice. It was low and raspy, speaking in a language I didn't recognize. The words were slow and deliberate, each syllable dripping with malice. "What is that?" Samantha whispered, her face pale. "I don't know," Brian said, his eyes glued to the book. "But I don't think it's friendly." The voice grew louder, more insistent, and the banging turned into scratching again. This time, it was coming from the roof. "It's on top of us," Lena whispered, her eyes wide with terror. "Everyone stay calm," Brian said, though his voice wavered. "Calm," Derek snapped. "Are you serious? There's something out there, and you want us to stay calm?" The RV shook violently, and we all screamed as the roof dented inward, as if something heavy was pressing down on it. Brian frantically flipped through the book, his eyes scanning the pages. "There's a ritual," he said finally. "But we need to draw the symbols." "What symbols?" Samantha demanded. "These," Brian said, holding up the book and pointing to a page filled with the same crude drawings we'd seen around the fire pit. "You've got to be kidding me," Derek said. "It's the only way," Brian insisted. With no other options, we grabbed whatever we could find, markers, pens, even ketchup, and started copying the symbols onto the RV walls and floor. The whole time, the banging and scratching continued, accompanied by the guttural voice and the laughter. As I drew one of the symbols, I felt a chill run down my spine. It was as if the air itself was alive, pressing against me, making it hard to breathe. "Are we sure this is a good idea?" Lena asked, her voice trembling. "No," Brian admitted, "but it's all we've got." As we finished the last symbol, the banging stopped. The laughter and voices fell silent, leaving us in an oppressive, suffocating stillness. "Did it work?" Samantha whispered. Before anyone could answer, the lights in the RV flickered and went out. The darkness inside the RV was absolute. For a moment, none of us moved. The only sound was the shallow, panicked breathing of 5 terrified people. "Brian," Samantha whispered, her voice trembling. "Why did the lights go out?" "I don't know," Brian stammered, clutching the book like it was a lifeline. Derek fumbled for his phone, the dim light of the screen cutting through the darkness as he turned on the flashlight. The beam danced across the cramped space, casting long, jittery shadows on the walls. "Check the symbols," Lena said, her voice barely audible. "Make sure they're all there." Brian nodded, fumbling to inspect the crude drawings we'd hastily scrawled on every available surface. He ran his fingers over the lines, muttering to himself as he checked each one. "They're fine," he said after a moment. "They're all fine." "Then why does it feel worse?" Derek hissed, shining his flashlight toward the ceiling. The silence that followed was heavy, oppressive, like the forest was pressing its weight down on the RV. And then we heard it, a slow, deliberate tapping on the roof. Tap, tap, tap. Samantha grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "What is that?" I shook my head, too afraid to speak. The tapping continued, growing louder and more insistent, until it sounded like something was walking across the roof. Whatever it was heavy. Each step made the RV creak and groan under the weight. I thought the symbols were supposed to stop it. Derek yelled, his voice rising in panic. "They're supposed to protect us," Brian said, his hands shaking. "But I don't think it's gone." A loud, metallic screech tore through the air as something dragged across the roof. The sound made my teeth ache and my skin crawl. "We need to get out of here," Lena said, her voice trembling. "How?" Derek snapped. "The RV won't start." "We run," Samantha said, her voice firm despite the fear in her eyes. "Into the forest?" I asked, my stomach twisting at the thought. "Do you have a better idea?" she shot back. Before we could decide, the RV lurched violently to the side, throwing us to the floor. The flashlight slipped from Derek's hand and rolled across the room, plunging us into darkness again. "What the hell was that?" Brian shouted. The RV lurched again, tilting dangerously. It felt like something was trying to flip us over. "We have to move," Samantha yelled, scrambling to her feet. Derek grabbed the flashlight and shined it toward the door. The beam caught the edge of a window, and my heart stopped. A face. It was pressed against the glass, its features distorted and wrong, like it wasn't meant to exist. Its eyes were too large. Its mouth stretched into an unnatural grin that showed far too many teeth. "Oh my God," Lena whispered, backing away. The face disappeared as quickly as it had appeared, leaving the window fogged with condensation. "That's it," Derek said, grabbing the RV door handle. "We're getting out of here." "Wait!" Brian shouted. "What if it's waiting for us? What if it's already in here?" Derek shot back, glaring at him. No one had an answer. The RV lurched again, this time harder, and we heard the sound of glass shattering. Something had broken a window. The cold night air rushed in, bringing with it the faint smell of decay. "Move!" Samantha shouted, shoving the door open and jumping outside. One by one, we followed her into the darkness. The forest loomed around us, the trees stretching up, like skeletal fingers against the night sky. The air was thick and heavy, making it hard to breathe. "Where do we go?" Lena asked, her voice shaking. Brian pointed toward the clearing, where we'd found the cabin. "There. It's open. We can see anything coming." "Are you insane?" Derek snapped. "We're not going back there. Do you want to stay here?" Brian shot back. Derek didn't answer, but the look on his face said enough. We ran. The forest seemed to close in around us, the trees casting long shadows that twisted and moved as we passed. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst, but I didn't stop. None of us did. Behind us, the sounds grew louder, heavy footsteps crashing through the underbrush. Low, guttural growls that seemed to come from all directions at once. "It's getting closer," Samantha yelled, glancing over her shoulder. "Don't look back," Brian shouted, but I couldn't help myself. I turned my head just in time to see a shadow dart between the trees, its form shifting and flickering like smoke. It was fast, too fast. "It's right behind us," I screamed. We burst into the clearing where the cabin stood, the moonlight illuminating the crumbling structure. It looked even worse in the dark, its warped wood and broken windows giving it the appearance of a gaping mouth ready to swallow us whole. "Inside!" Brian shouted, leading the way. "No way," Derek said, skidding to a stop. "I'm not going in there." "Then stay out here and die," Brian snapped, disappearing through the doorway. The rest of us hesitated for only a moment before following him inside. The cabin was just as cold and damp as the cellar had been, the air thick with the scent of rot. "What now?" Samantha asked, her voice tight. Brian didn't answer. He was already flipping through the book, his eyes scanning the pages frantically. "There's another ritual," he said finally. "A banishment. But we need," he trailed off, his face pale. "We need what?" Lena demanded. "Blood," he said, his voice barely audible. "It says we need blood." The room fell silent. "You've got to be kidding me," Derek said, shaking his head. Brian held up the book. "It's the only way." "No," Derek said firmly. "Absolutely not. There's no way I'm cutting myself open for some stupid ritual. We don't have a choice." Brian shouted, "If we don't do this, we're all dead." As if to punctuate his words, a loud crash echoed through the cabin. Something had slammed against the door, hard enough to make the entire structure shake. "Fine," Derek yelled, grabbing a broken piece of glass from the floor. "But if this doesn't work, I'm haunting your ass." One by one, we each made a small cut on our palms, letting the blood drip onto the stone altar in the center of the room. Brian recited the words from the book, his voice trembling but steady. "Outside, The growls and footsteps grew louder, closer. The door groaned under the weight of something pressing against it. "Hurry up!" Samantha shouted. "I'm almost done," Brian snapped, his voice rising in panic. The air in the cabin grew colder, and the shadows on the walls seemed to stretch and twist, reaching toward us. I could feel someone watching us, its presence heavy and suffocating. "Brian!" Lena screamed as the door splintered. Brian shouted the last words of the ritual, slamming the book shut. For a moment, everything went still, and then, with a deafening roar, the shadows outside disappeared, leaving behind only silence. We stared at each other, our breaths coming in ragged gasps. The cabin was still, the oppressive weight that had surrounded us finally lifted. "Did it work?" Samantha whispered. Brian nodded, his hands shaking. "I think so." Derek let out a shaky laugh, collapsing onto the floor. "Next time, we're going to the beach." That night, the forest came alive. After our unsettling discovery in the cabin cellar, we agreed to head back to the RV and stay close to camp. No one said it out loud, but the fear was palpable. Even Samantha, who usually brushed everything off with a joke or a smirk, had fallen quiet. The book Brian had taken sat on the RV's dining table, its cracked leather cover looking like it didn't belong in this world. "Why'd you have to bring it?" Derek muttered, pacing the small space. He hadn't stopped complaining since we got back. "We should have left it there." "It's a historical artifact," Brian argued, his voice firm but a little defensive. "It could explain what's going on out here. Or it could curse us all." Derek snapped, throwing up his hands. "You saw those symbols. You saw that blood. And you still thought, hey, let's bring this creepy-ass book back to our tiny RV. Brilliant, Brian. Just brilliant." "Guys, enough," Samantha said, rubbing her temples. "Arguing isn't going to help." Lena sat in the corner, her knees pulled to her chest, staring out the window into the dark forest. "It's already too late," she said softly. "What's that supposed to mean?" Derek demanded, turning to her. Lena didn't answer. She just kept staring out the window. Around 10 p.m., the noises started again. It began as faint scratching, like twigs brushing against the side of the RV. At first, I thought it was the wind, but when I glanced out the window, the trees were completely still. "Do you hear that?" I asked, breaking the silence. Brian frowned, tilting his head to listen. "Yeah, what is that?" The scratching grew louder, more insistent. It moved along the RV, starting at the back and making its way toward the front. "Okay, nope," Derek said, grabbing the largest knife from the kitchenette. Nope. "Calm down," Samantha said, though her voice was shaky. Suddenly, the scratching stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, pressing in on us like a physical weight. Then came the laughter. It was faint at first, so soft that I thought I might have imagined it. But it grew louder, high-pitched and breathy, like a child giggling in the distance. "What the hell is that?" Samantha whispered, her eyes wide. "Not funny, Brian," Derek said, pointing the knife at him. "It's not me." Brian snapped. The laughter grew louder, echoing all around us. It was coming from the forest, or maybe it was right outside the RV. It was impossible to tell. Lena stood up suddenly, her face pale. "It's them," she said, her voice trembling. "Who?" I asked, my heart pounding. "The shadows," she said, pointing out the window. "They're here." I followed her gaze and froze. Outside, just beyond the firelight, The shadows had returned. They flickered and shifted like smoke, darting between the trees, moving closer and closer. "Okay, we're leaving," Derek said, backing toward the driver's seat. "Wait," Brian said, grabbing his arm. "We can't just leave." What if... A loud bang cut him off. It sounded like something had slammed against the side of the RV. The whole vehicle shook and Lena screamed, pressing herself against the wall. "Start the engine," Samantha yelled. Derek didn't need to be told twice. He jumped into the driver's seat and turned the key. The engine sputtered, coughed, and died. "No, no, no," Derek muttered, trying again. The engine refused to start. Another bang, louder this time, rocked the RV. The laughter outside turned into a chorus, overlapping voices that didn't belong to any human. "Do something," Samantha shouted. Brian grabbed the book and started flipping through the pages, his hands shaking. "There has to be something in here," he muttered. "What are you looking for?" I demanded. "I don't know. A way to stop this." The banging grew more violent, as if whatever was outside was trying to tear its way in. The windows rattled, and the laughter turned into guttural growls. Then we heard it, a voice. It was low and raspy, speaking in a language I didn't recognize. The words were slow and deliberate, each syllable dripping with malice. "What is that?" Samantha whispered, her face pale. "I don't know," Brian said, his eyes glued to the book. "But I don't think it's friendly." The voice grew louder, more insistent, and the banging turned into scratching again. This time, it was coming from the roof. "It's on top of us," Lena whispered, her eyes wide with terror. "Everyone stay calm," Brian said, though his voice wavered. "Calm," Derek snapped. "Are you serious? There's something out there, and you want us to stay calm?" The RV shook violently, and we all screamed as the roof dented inward, as if something heavy was pressing down on it. Brian frantically flipped through the book, his eyes scanning the pages. "There's a ritual," he said finally, "but we need to draw the symbols." "What symbols?" Samantha demanded. "These," Brian said, holding up the book and pointing to a page filled with the same crude drawings we'd seen around the fire pit. "You've got to be kidding me," Derek said. "It's the only way," Brian insisted. With no other options, we grabbed whatever we could find, markers, pens, even ketchup, and started copying the symbols onto the RV walls and floor. The whole time, the banging and scratching continued, accompanied by the guttural voice and the laughter. As I drew one of the symbols, I felt a chill run down my spine. It was as if the air itself was alive, pressing against me, making it hard to breathe. "Are we sure this is a good idea?" Lena asked, her voice trembling. "No," Brian admitted, "but it's all we've got." As we finished the last symbol, the banging stopped. The laughter and voices fell silent, leaving us in an oppressive, suffocating stillness. "Did it work?" Samantha whispered. Before anyone could answer, the lights in the RV flickered and went out. The creature's scream was unlike anything I'd ever heard, deep, guttural, and piercing all at once. It echoed through the clearing, reverberating in my chest like a physical blow. We all stood frozen, watching in horror as the ground beneath it began to crumble, exposing a faint, glowing light that seemed to pulse in time with the creature's convulsions. "Is it working?" Samantha asked, her voice tight with fear. "I don't know," Brian shouted, his eyes glued to the book in his hands. "It's not in the description." "Not in the description?" Derek yelled, his voice climbing an octave. "You're telling me this isn't part of the plan?" Brian ignored him, his hands shaking as he flipped through the book's yellowed pages. "There's more," he muttered. "We need to seal it." "Seal it? How?" I asked, my voice barely audible over the creature's roars. Brian pointed to the glowing fissures spreading across the ground. "We need to mark the edges of the cracks with the symbols. It'll trap it." "Are you kidding me?" Derek snapped, glancing at the writhing creature. "You want us to get close to that thing? If we don't, it'll get out," Brian yelled, his voice frantic. Without waiting for a response, Samantha grabbed a stick and used the ash from the fire pit to start drawing the symbols on the dirt near one of the cracks. Her movements were quick but precise, her jaw set in determination. "I'll help," Lena said, her voice trembling but steady. She grabbed another stick and knelt beside Samantha, tracing one of the jagged symbols onto the ground. I hesitated, my heart pounding as I looked at the creature. It was still frozen in place, but its head twitched violently, and its hollow eyes seemed to scan the clearing, as if searching for a way out. "Come on," Brian shouted, snapping me out of my daze. I grabbed a rock and moved toward another section of the fissures, copying the symbols as best as I could from memory. Derek, muttering a string of curses under his breath, reluctantly joined in, using a piece of broken wood to carve the marks into the dirt. The creature's roars grew louder, shaking the ground beneath our feet. It thrashed violently, its limbs twisting and stretching in impossible ways. The glowing light beneath it pulsed brighter, illuminating its grotesque form in stark detail. "Faster!" Brian yelled, his eyes darting between the book and the fissures. "I'm going as fast as I can," Derek snapped, sweat dripping down his face. As I finished the last symbol in my section, I looked up and saw the creature's gaze snap toward Lena. Its body lurched forward, as if straining against whatever invisible force was holding it in place. "Lena, move!" I screamed. She turned just as the creature's clawed arm lashed out, slicing through the air where she'd been crouching moments before. She scrambled backward, her stick clattering to the ground as she fell. "I'm okay," she called out, her voice shaking. "Keep going." Samantha finished her section and ran to help Lena, pulling her to her feet. Together, they completed the final set of symbols, their hands moving with desperate precision. "It's done," Samantha shouted, stepping back from the edge of the glowing fissures. Brian glanced at the book, his face pale. "Now we need to close it." "Close it? How?" Derek demanded. Brian hesitated, then looked at the altar's shattered remains. "We need to use the blood," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "What blood?" I asked, my stomach twisting. "Ours," Brian said, holding up his already bandaged hand. "Of course," Derek muttered, because this night wasn't insane enough. One by one, we reopened the small cuts on our palms, letting the blood drip onto the symbols we'd drawn. The moment my blood hit the dirt, the glowing light seemed to react, pulsing brighter before dimming slightly. The creature let out another ear-splitting roar, its body convulsing as the fissures began to close. The ground shook violently and I stumbled, barely catching myself before falling. "Keep going," Brian yelled, his voice nearly drowned out by the noise. We moved quickly, marking each symbol with our blood as the fissures slowly sealed themselves. The creature thrashed harder, its movements growing more frantic with every passing second. "It's working," Samantha shouted, a note of hope in her voice. But the creature wasn't giving up. With a guttural snarl, it slammed its claws into the ground, pulling itself forward inch by inch. The glowing light beneath it dimmed further, but the fissures weren't closing fast enough. "It's trying to escape," Lena screamed. "Not if I can help it," Derek muttered. He grabbed a burning log from the fire pit and hurled it at the creature. The log struck its back, sending up a spray of sparks, but the creature didn't react. "Do it again," Brian yelled. Derek grabbed another log and threw it with all his strength. This time, it hit the creature's head, and it let out a roar of pain, its body recoiling slightly. "It's working," I shouted, grabbing a third log. We pelted the creature with everything we could find, rocks, sticks, anything that might slow it down. Each hit seemed to weaken it, its movements growing slower and more erratic. Finally, with a deafening crack, the last of the fissures closed. The glowing light disappeared, plunging the clearing into darkness. The creature let out one final, anguished scream before its body collapsed into itself, dissolving into a thick, black smoke that dissipated into the air. For a long moment, none of us moved. The forest was silent again, the oppressive weight that had surrounded us finally lifted. "Is it gone?" Samantha asked, her voice trembling. "I think so," Brian said, his voice barely above a whisper. Derek let out a shaky laugh, collapsing onto the ground. "I swear, I'm never going camping again." But as we stood there, catching our breath, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching us. The forest was quiet, too quiet. "We need to leave," Lena said, her voice tight. "No arguments here," Derek muttered, pulling himself to his feet. We made our way back to the RV, the forest seeming darker and more menacing with every step. When we reached the clearing, the RV was still there, its windows shattered and its sides dented. "Will it even start?" Samantha asked, eyeing the damage. "It better," Derek said, climbing into the driver's seat. Brian handed him the keys, and we all held our breath as he turned the ignition. The engine sputtered for a moment before roaring to life. "Thank God," Derek muttered, throwing the RV into gear. As we drove away, the forest loomed behind us, its dark shadows stretching toward the road like grasping hands. I stared out the window, my heart pounding as the memories of the night played over and over in my mind. "It's really over," Samantha said, more to herself than anyone else. But deep down, I wasn't so sure. The RV rattled down the road, its battered frame groaning with every bump and turn. None of us spoke. The air inside was thick with tension, the weight of what we'd just survived pressing down on all of us. I sat by the window, staring into the darkness as the trees whipped past. Every shadow felt alive, every flicker of movement sent my heart racing. I wanted to believe it was over, that we'd left whatever nightmare had plagued us back in the clearing. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't. Brian was hunched over the book in his lap, his flashlight casting an eerie glow over the cracked pages. He'd barely looked up since we'd left, his lips moving silently as he read. "Do you have to keep staring at that thing?" Derek snapped from the driver's seat. "We should have left it back there. Burned it. Something. It might be the only thing keeping us safe," Brian said without looking up. "Safe," Derek barked, slamming his hand against the steering wheel. "Do you call this safe? My RV is trashed. We've been chased by some hell beast, and you're sitting there reading like it's story time." "Derek, stop," Samantha said softly from the passenger seat. "We're all on edge. Yelling isn't going to help." Derek muttered something under his breath but didn't argue. "We need to talk about what happened back there," Lena said after a long silence. Her voice was quiet but firm. "That thing, whatever it wasn't random. It was connected to the symbols, the altar, everything. Brian nodded. I think it's tied to the land, he said, flipping a page in the book. The book mentions a guardian, a being meant to protect something ancient, something buried beneath the forest. Protected from what? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Brian hesitated. From us, I think. From anyone who tries to disturb it. Derek let out a bitter laugh. Great. So we pissed off a supernatural guard dog. Awesome. It's not just a guardian, Brian continued, his voice growing more serious. The book talks about a curse, something that marks anyone who crosses certain boundaries or performs certain rituals. Like what we did. Samantha asked, her face pale. Brian nodded. The symbols we found, the altar, even being in the cellar, those were all part of it. We triggered something. And now what? Lena demanded. Brian looked up, his eyes dark. Now it's not going to stop. A heavy silence filled the RV. I could feel my pulse quickening, a cold sweat breaking out on the back of my neck. What do you mean, it's not going to stop? Samantha asked, her voice rising. The curse doesn't end when you leave, Brian said, his grip tightening on the book. It follows you. It lingers. That's what the Guardian was trying to do. Mark us, tie us to this place. You're saying we're cursed? Derek asked, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. Brian didn't answer, but the look on his face was enough. Oh, hell no, Derek muttered. We're not doing this. We're not taking this thing home with us. It's not that simple, Lena said quietly. You saw what happened back there. This isn't something we can just walk away from. As if to punctuate her words, the RV's headlights flickered. The engine sputtered, then roared back to life, the sudden noise making all of us jump. What the hell was that? Samantha asked, gripping the armrest. I don't know, Derek said through gritted teeth, his eyes darting. To the dashboard. The RV's been acting up since the thing attacked it. Or it's something else, Lena whispered. We all turned to look at her, the weight of her words settling over us like a shroud. Brian flipped through the book again, his hands trembling. There's a way to break the curse, he said finally. Great, Derek said. What's the catch? Brian hesitated. We have to go back. No, Samantha said immediately. Absolutely not. We don't have a choice, Brian said, his voice firm. The book says the only way to break the curse is to confront it, to undo what we started. You mean the Guardian? Lena asked, her voice trembling. Brian nodded. We have to send it back, completely. If we don't, the curse will stay with us. Forever. The thought of going back to that forest made my stomach churn. But the alternative, being haunted by whatever dark force we'd awakened, was worse. How do we do it? I asked, my voice shaking. Brian looked down at the book, his brow furrowed. There's another ritual, he said slowly. A final one, but it's dangerous. If we mess it up, he didn't need to finish the sentence. Let's think about this, Samantha said, her voice desperate. We don't even know if the curse is real. What if this is all just, I don't know, superstition? Maybe the creature's gone and we're freaking out over nothing. It's not gone, Lena said firmly. I can still feel it. We all turned to look at her. What do you mean? Derek asked, his voice wary. Lena hesitated, her eyes darting to the window. It's hard to explain, she said finally, but it's like it's watching us, waiting. Waiting for what? I asked, my throat dry. For us to fail, she said. The RV's headlights flickered again, and this time, the engine sputtered to a complete stop. The RV rolled to a halt in the middle of the road, the sudden silence making my heart pound. "No, no, no," Derek muttered, frantically turning the key in the ignition. The engine groaned but refused to start. "What's happening?" Samantha asked, panic creeping into her voice. "I don't know," Derek snapped, slamming his fist against the dashboard. Brian grabbed the book and flipped to the back, his eyes scanning the text. "It's the curse," he said, his voice grim. "It's not going to let us leave." A low, guttural growl echoed through the darkness outside. My breath caught in my throat as I turned toward the window. At first, I saw nothing, just the shadows of the trees and the faint glow of moonlight. But then, between the trees, I saw it. The shadow. It was taller now, more defined, its twisted form shifting and flickering like smoke. Its hollow eyes locked onto the RV, and my blood turned to ice. "It's here," Lena whispered. The growl grew louder, and the RV shook violently, as if something massive had slammed into it. "Brian," Samantha said, her voice shaking. "What do we do?" Brian's hands trembled as he turned the page. "We have to finish the ritual," he said, his voice barely audible. Now, before we could respond, the shadow lunged. The RV tipped violently to the side, throwing us to the floor. Glass shattered, and the growl turned into a deafening roar. "Get the book," Brian shouted, scrambling to his feet. I grabbed the flashlight and shone it toward the shadow. Its form twisted and writhed, its jagged claws tearing into the RV's walls. "We have to draw the symbols." "Again," Brian yelled, his voice frantic. "Hurry!" Working as quickly as we could, we grabbed whatever we could find to draw the symbols, markers, ash, even the blood still dripping from our palms. The RV rocked violently, the creature's roars growing louder with every second. "Keep going," Brian shouted, his voice nearly drowned out by the noise. As I finished the last symbol, the creature let out an ear-splitting shriek. The air around us grew colder, and the shadows seemed to stretch and twist, reaching for us. "Brian!" I screamed. He shouted the final words of the ritual, his voice echoing through the RV. The air crackled with energy and the shadow froze, its form trembling violently. For a moment, everything was still. Then, with a deafening roar, the shadow dissolved into smoke, disappearing into the night. The RV fell silent. The oppressive weight lifted, and for the first time, the forest felt normal. "Is it over?" Samantha asked, her voice trembling. Brian nodded, his hands still shaking. "I think so," he said. But as I stared out the window, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, waiting. The RV sat in eerie silence, the air thick with the lingering tension of what we had just survived. None of us moved for what felt like minutes, waiting to see if the shadow, the creature, or whatever else the forest might throw at us would return. The only sound was a faint hum of the RV's engine, which somehow had sputtered back to life after Brian completed the ritual. "Is it gone?" Samantha whispered, breaking the silence. Brian let out a shaky breath, clutching the book tightly to his chest. "I think so," he said, his voice barely audible. "You think so?" Derek shot back, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. "Not good enough, man. We're getting the hell out of here." "Agreed," Samantha said, turning in her seat. "We've got everything we need, right?" "The book," Brian said, glancing at it. "We need to take it with us." "No, we don't," Derek snapped. "That thing is what got us into this mess in the first place." Leave it. Brian shook his head. If we leave it, someone else could find it. This isn't over if it stays here. We have to take it with us. Maybe even figure out how to destroy it properly this time. Derek groaned but didn't argue further. Fine, whatever, but we're leaving now. Derek floored the gas pedal and the RV lurched forward, rumbling down the dirt road that wound through the forest. The headlights cut through the darkness, but the shadows seemed thicker, deeper, as if the forest was reluctant to let us go. No one spoke. The tension was suffocating, each of us staring out the windows as if expecting the shadow to reappear at any moment. Do you think it's really over? Lena finally asked, her voice trembling. Brian hesitated, his eyes locked on the book. I don't know, he admitted. The ritual should have sealed it, but what? I asked, gripping the edge of my seat. Brian looked at me, his expression grim. The book says the curse lingers. Even if we sealed the guardian, the mark it left on us might not fade. Not entirely. So, what does that mean? Samantha demanded, her voice rising. It means we might not be safe, Brian said quietly. Not yet. As if on cue, the RV jolted violently, throwing us all forward. Derek Schlomonde brakes, and the RV screeched to a halt, the engine sputtering before falling silent. What the hell was that? Samantha shouted, clutching the dashboard. I don't know. Derek snapped, fumbling to restart the engine. It groaned but refused to turn over. Not again, Lena whispered, her eyes wide as she stared out the window. What do you mean? Not again, Derek asked, panic creeping into his voice. Lena pointed to the road ahead. Look. At first, I didn't see anything. The headlights illuminated the dirt road and the trees on either side. But there was nothing unusual. Then I saw it, a figure standing in the middle of the road, just beyond the reach of the headlights. It was tall and thin, its outline barely visible in the darkness. Its head tilted slightly to one side, as if it were watching us. Is that? Samantha trailed off, her voice trembling. It's not human, Brian said, his voice firm. Don't get out of the RV. Wasn't planning on it, Derek muttered, trying the ignition again. The engine sputtered to life, but the headlights flickered, casting erratic shadows that made the figure seem to move. Drive, Samantha said, her eyes fixed on the figure. Derek didn't need to be told twice. He slammed his foot on the gas, and the RV surged forward. The figure didn't move, didn't flinch, even as the headlights washed over it. And then, just as we passed it, it disappeared. What the hell was that? Derek shouted, his voice shaking. Keep driving, Brian said, his eyes darting toward the book. Don't stop for anything. We barreled down the road, the RV rattling with every bump and turn. The trees on either side seemed to close in, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The darkness felt alive, pressing against the windows, whispering threats we couldn't hear but could somehow feel. Are we even going the right way? Samantha asked, glancing at Derek. I think so, he said, his voice uncertain. You think? Lena asked, her voice rising. What if we're going in circles? We're not, Brian said firmly. We're almost out. Just keep going. The road ahead seemed endless, stretching into the abyss of the forest. Every shadow looked like it was moving. Every sound made my heart race. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed, that the shadowy figure was still out there, lurking just beyond the reach of the headlights. Then, finally, we saw it. A break in the trees, the faint glow of streetlights in the distance. "There!" Samantha shouted, pointing. "We're almost out." Relief washed over me as the RV broke free of the forest, the paved road beneath us feeling like solid ground after being lost at sea. The oppressive weight lifted slightly, though I still felt a lingering unease. "We made it," Derek said, his voice shaky. "We're out." But it didn't feel over. As we drove toward the nearest town, the tension inside the RV remained. No one spoke, each of us lost in our own thoughts. I stared out the window, half expecting to see the shadow following us, but the road behind us was empty. When we finally reached the edge of town, Derek pulled into the parking lot of a gas station. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, their hum a strange comfort after the silence of the forest. "We should call someone," Samantha said, her voice quiet. "The police, maybe." "And tell them what?" Derek asked, turning off the engine. "That we were attacked by a shadow monster in the Bridgewater Triangle?" "Yeah, I'm sure they'll take that real seriously." "She's right," Brian said. "No one would believe us. But we still need to report what we found. Maybe not everything, but the symbols, the cellar. Someone needs to know." "Fine," Derek muttered. "But first, I'm getting a drink." While Derek went inside, the rest of us stayed in the RV, the weight of the night pressing down on us. "What happens now?" Lena asked, breaking the silence. Brian looked at the book in his lap, his expression grim. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I think we need to be careful. The ritual might have sealed the guardian, but it didn't undo the mark it left on us. So we're cursed?" Samantha asked, her voice trembling. "Maybe," Brian said, "or maybe it's just watching us, waiting." "For what?" I asked, my stomach twisting. Brian didn't answer. When Derek returned, we drove in silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts. The forest was behind us, but its shadow lingered, creeping into the corners of my mind. Even now, years later, I can't shake the feeling that it's not over. Every shadow, every whisper of wind feels like a reminder, a warning. The Bridgewater Triangle doesn't let you go. Not really. And sometimes on quiet nights, I swear I can still hear the laughter. So, what do you think? Was it the forest, the ritual, or something ancient that marked us? Even now, I don't have all the answers, but one thing's for sure, the Bridgewater Triangle doesn't let you go easily. Have you ever experienced something you can't explain? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear your stories. Maybe they're even more terrifying than mine. Don't forget to like this video if it gave you chills, share it with someone who loves a good horror story, and subscribe to the channel for more tales of the unexplained. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a new upload. Trust me, the next one is just as wild as this. Until next time, stay curious, stay safe, and watch your back.